Imagine trying to calculate the load-bearing capacity of a steel suspension bridge using nothing but your feelings.
Oh boy, good luck with that.
Right. Like, you don't use physics, you don't use mathematics, and you certainly don't use, any historical engineering data at all.
You're just totally winging it.
Exactly. Instead, you just sit the whole construction crew down in a circle and you ask them how the tensile strength of the cables validates their lived experience.
Wow.
And then when the bridge inevitably collapses, you don't blame gravity. You blame the structural engineers for lacking empathy.
Yeah, that's a wild hypothetical.
Well, according to a highly provocative new manifesto, that is actually not a hypothetical scenario at all. That is the exact blueprint of how modern Western society is attempting to build its future.
Right. And that is quite the claim.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive. Before we plunge into today's material, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss out on our explorations of the most complex, controversial, and frankly fascinating texts out there.
Definitely do that.
Today we are unpacking an incredibly dense ebook. It's titled Barbarians at the Gates of Reason, a polemical defense of patriarchal authority against the dark ages of leftism, and it's by Conrad Riker.
Quite the title.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back. We highly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book and read the source material for yourself. Also, make sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack for more of his ongoing writing.
Okay, so I am going to step in right here at the very top to establish some absolute ground rules for you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
Extremely important. The text we are dissecting today is highly polemical. It is a politically charged manifesto, and it's written specifically for a red-pilled, men's rights activist manosphere audience.
Right.
So I want to make it explicitly clear to everyone tuning in, we are not taking sides today.
Nope, not at all.
Nor are we endorsing these viewpoints. Our mission today is just to impartially report on the contents of the book, to dissect the author's intellectual architecture, and to help you understand exactly how Riker argues that Western institutions have been systematically captured by what he terms feminists and Marxists.
Exactly. We are just analyzing the structural engineering of his argument.
Right. We aren't validating it. We certainly aren't here to preach about the ethics of it. We are simply mapping the territory.
Okay, so to understand how Riker believes our modern institutions were captured, we first have to understand the foundation he believes those institutions were built upon in the first place.
Right, his historical baseline.
Yeah. Riker doesn't view Western civilization like the aqueducts, the electrical grids, the legal systems. He doesn't view them as some collaborative, happy accident of geography and time.
No, not at all.
He argues that this specific civilizational architecture was forged entirely by what he calls patriarchal authority and empirical reason.
And he anchors this entire worldview in antiquity, specifically the agora of ancient Greece.
Which is really interesting. Let's talk about the agora.
Yeah, well, the way Riker frames the agora is crucial to his entire thesis. For him, it wasn't merely a marketplace where people traded, olives and pottery.
Right.
It was an arena of brutal intellectual friction. It was a physical space where ideas were subjected to just merciless stress testing.
So truth wasn't something you arrived at through consensus.
Exactly, or by ensuring everyone felt heard. Truth was hammered out through rigorous, unyielding debate.
Okay, so he contrasts this classical pursuit of truth with the modern intellectual environment, and he leans really heavily on Aristotle's organon for this.
He does. And let's unpack the organon for a moment, because Riker references it constantly throughout the book.
Yeah, it's basically his manual. It's essentially Aristotle's collected works on logic, right? But Riker treats it less like a philosophy textbook and much more like a weapons manual.
He absolutely does. I mean, Aristotle formalized deductive reasoning. He created the categorical syllogism.
Which is the idea that if premise A is true and premise B is true, then conclusion C is an unavoidable mathematical reality.
Right. Regardless of how anyone feels about it. And Riker takes this Greek logic and he combines it with Roman pragmatism and the Judeo-Christian ethical frameworks found in Thomas Aquinas.
He specifically highlights Aquinas' Summa Theologica, right?
Yes, focusing on how Aquinas synthesized Aristotelian logic with a moral framework that heavily valued objective human labor, self-ownership, and private property.
So he sets up this historical triad. You've got Greek logic, Roman pragmatism, and Judeo-Christian property rights.
And he views that as the absolute pinnacle of human societal evolution.
And, crucially, he frames all of that classical rigor as explicitly male-coded.
Right, which sets up the dichotomy for his diagnosis of the modern era.
Exactly, because then he introduces this concept of female-coded leftism. According to his architecture, modern society has basically descended into an emotional tyranny.
Yeah, he says we've replaced the intellectual combat of the Greek agora with a modern safe space.
Right. He draws a direct comparison between modern institutional culture, so think like corporate HR departments or university campuses, and a sterilized daycare center.
A daycare center? Wow.
Yeah. He says the primary directive of a daycare center is to protect feelings and prevent any physical or emotional abrasions, which completely subordinates objective reality to emotional comfort.
And he insists that his readers respond to this shift with militant precision. He introduces a framework he calls syllogistic warfare.
Syllogistic warfare, that's intense.
It is. He is literally commanding his audience to pick up Aristotelian logic and wield it as a weapon against what he calls the NPC zombie mob.
Right, because he argues that modern leftist epistemology is completely detached from the noumenal realm.
Yes, borrowing from Immanuel Kant there.
Right. Kant divided the world into the phenomenal, which is how we perceive things, and the noumenal,
which is the objective, fundamental reality of the universe as it actually is, totally independent of our observation.
So Riker argues the modern left is trapped entirely in a subjective, phenomenal echo chamber.
And to arm his readers, he provides what he calls the syllogism of self-refutation, specifically targeting postmodernism. He lays it out like a literal geometric proof.
Okay, let's hear the proof.
So premise 1. Leftists claim all truth is subjective and culturally constructed.
Right.
Premise 2. This claim itself is stated as an absolute objective truth.
Okay.
Conclusion. Leftist epistemology is mathematically and structurally self-refuting. It just collapses under its own weight.
Got it. So he argues that by recognizing this mathematical collapse, you don't ever have to engage emotionally with modern social justice arguments.
Exactly. If the foundational premise of the opponent's worldview contradicts itself, well, the debate is over before it even begins.
But, okay, let's unpack this. This is where Riker's underlying assumptions require some serious scrutiny, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Because he essentially maps all logic, reason, and structure onto male biology. And then he maps all chaotic emotion, boundlessness, and hysteria onto female biology.
Well,
taking thousands of years of human philosophical thought and claiming it's an exclusively biological, gendered trait, rather than just a universal human capacity. I mean, that is a massive leap. How does he legally or philosophically actually justify making that leap?
Well, he grounds it in a very specific hardline interpretation of Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, heavily seasoned with modern evolutionary psychology. Riker's argument is one of absolute biological determinism.
So it's all hardwired.
Completely. He argues that human beings, like any other mammal, are the products of millions of years of unyielding evolutionary pressures. According to his reading of biology, the harshness of the ancestral environment hardwired the male brain for systemizing.
Systemizing, meaning what, practically?
Meaning men had to track prey, calculate trajectories, build shelters that wouldn't collapse, and construct rigid meritocratic hierarchies to defend the tribe. The penalty for failing to recognize objective reality wasn't hurt feelings, it was immediate death.
Okay, and his view on the female biological imperative.
He argues that evolutionary pressures hardwired the female brain for empathizing and prioritizing social cohesion. In that ancestral environment, a mother's primary evolutionary goal was the survival of highly vulnerable infants.
Right, which requires a completely different skill set.
Exactly. To achieve that, the brain needed to be exquisitely tuned to emotional states, distress signals, and maintaining peace within the communal group.
I see. So, to Riker, when men build meritocratic hierarchies, they aren't constructing arbitrary power dynamics just to oppress people?
No, he says they are fulfilling a biological imperative. They're manifesting their biological destiny into societal structure.
So in his view, trying to dismantle a patriarchy is quite literally like trying to dismantle gravity.
That is exactly how he sees it. You aren't just fighting a political system. You are fighting the biological reality of the human species.
Wow. And if you attempt to enforce an equality of outcome across a society where people have vastly different biological drives and aptitudes, it requires the deliberate, forceful subjugation of reality.
Which, Riker claims, ultimately requires infinite state violence against male competence.
Okay, which brings us to the obvious historical friction point.
Right, the big question.
Yeah. If Western civilization was built on such an ironclad, successful foundation of empirical logic and Darwinian reality-like, if the architecture was so perfect, why is it currently crumbling, according to Riker?
Well, he calls this the Enlightenment betrayal. And he points his finger directly at modern science and academia.
Okay, so he praises the Enlightenment initially.
Oh, he holds it up as the golden era. He praises thinkers like John Locke, Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon.
Sure.
He dwells specifically on the year 1660 and the founding of the Royal Society of London. Their motto was nullius in verba.
Which means take nobody's word for it.
Exactly. This was the ultimate establishment of objective verification. You don't trust the king, you don't trust the pope, and you definitely don't trust your own feelings. You trust the data, the weight, the measurement.
Right, so what was the betrayal?
The betrayal, in his eyes, is that modern academia has completely abandoned that empirical scientific method. He claims our universities have traded the pursuit of objective truth for the Marxist god of equity.
Wow.
Yeah, he argues that academia is now mass-producing corrupted pseudosciences. Things like sociology, gender studies, grievance studies, and they do this just to retroactively validate emotional biases.
And he actually provides some extensive historical receipts to back up this claim.
He does. He starts with the replication crisis that devastated the soft sciences back in the 2010s.
Yeah, the replication crisis is a massive piece of his puzzle. For listeners who might be unfamiliar with the mechanics of this, it wasn't just like a minor academic hiccup.
No, it was a total earthquake.
In the 2010s, researchers attempted to replicate the findings of highly cited foundational sociological and psychological studies. And they found that a shocking percentage of these studies, sometimes over 50% in certain journals, could not be replicated at all.
Right, meaning the results were functionally useless.
Exactly. So Riker uses the mathematical mechanisms behind this crisis to prove his point.
He points to phenomena like p-hacking. This is when researchers manipulate their data analysis, right?
Yeah.
They test dozens of variables until they find a statistically significant pattern, a p-value of less than 0.05.
And then they publish that as a profound discovery.
Yes, while completely ignoring all the data that contradicted it. Riker doesn't just view this as sloppy statistics. He views it as the direct infiltration of female-coded empathy into the scientific method.
Interesting. So he argues these researchers are prioritizing the emotional rush of a compelling narrative or the desire to publish results that validate progressive social theories over the stoic masculine virtue of separating one's ego from the data.
That's his exact argument. And he takes this a step further by bringing up the 2017 to 2018 grievance studies affair.
Oh, the Sokal Squared hoax.
Yes, widely known as Sokal Squared. James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose spent a year intentionally writing utterly absurd, logically bankrupt academic papers.
Right. They wanted to see if prestigious, peer-reviewed academic journals would actually publish complete nonsense.
Provided that the nonsense used the correct ideological buzzwords, about equity, systemic oppression, the patriarchy.
And the results were staggering. Several of these fabricated papers were actually peer-reviewed, accepted, and published as groundbreaking academic theory.
It's wild.
I mean, one of the papers that got published was literally a chapter from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf.
Yeah, what, really? A chapter from Mein Kampf?
Yes. But they used a find and replace tool to swap out the anti-Semitic terms with modern feminist terminology. And the peer reviewers praised the paper.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
For Riker, this is the ultimate smoking gun. It proves that these academic journals are no longer engaged in the Royal Society's nullius in verba. They are just NPC echo chambers.
They only care about ideological compliance.
Oh.
If the data conflicts with the ideology, well, the data is just discarded.
Exactly.
And he also highlights the dark, tangible consequences of this ideological shift, moving from academic hoaxes to profound human tragedy.
Okay, what does he point to?
He extensively covers the case of John Money and David Reimer from 1967.
Oh, that is a tragic case.
Extremely. David suffered a botched circumcision as an infant. And John Money, who was an incredibly influential psychologist at Johns Hopkins at the time, he was aggressively pushing the idea that gender is entirely a social construct, a blank slate.
Right.
So Money convinced David's parents to raise the boy as a girl.
And Money used this case for years to publicly validate his theories on gender performativity.
He did.
But the biological reality was that David was profoundly traumatized. He never identified as a girl, his life was just agonizing, and the situation ultimately ended in a horrific double tragedy for him and his brother.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And Riker uses this as the ultimate horrific endpoint of blank slate ideology. He argues that when you attempt to force unyielding biological reality to submit to academic social theories, the result isn't liberation, it is catastrophic human suffering.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because Riker's reliance on these examples introduces a massive paradox.
Okay, how so?
Well, he's essentially describing modern academia, media, and tech companies as hosts for this ideological rot, right?
Right.
But isn't there a paradox here? Rikers is presumably typing his manifesto on a laptop, he's using the internet, he's communicating his ideas via satellite networks. All of these things are the direct result of Newtonian physics, the scientific method, and high-trust academic research.
That's a very fair point.
I look at this like the cordyceps fungus. If you know anything about the cordyceps, it's a parasite that infects an ant. It doesn't build the ant's nervous system, it just hijacks it. It drives the ant to climb to the top of a blade of grass so the fungus can explode and spread its spores.
Right, the zombie ant fungus.
Exactly. So isn't Riker pointing at the ant and claiming the ant is dead, while completely ignoring the fact that the ant's legs are still perfectly functional? How does he reconcile complaining that science is dead using a smartphone?
Well, that cordyceps metaphor is actually exactly how Riker conceptualizes the modern landscape.
Yeah.
He is well aware of the paradox.
Oh, he is?
Yes. He explicitly argues that the left are ideological parasites. He says they do not build the infrastructure, they don't pour the concrete, they don't string the fiber optic cables, and they certainly don't calculate the orbital mechanics of the satellites.
How?
He argues they merely inhabit and exploit the infrastructure that was built by patriarchal logic. He literally writes that they are breathing the oxygen of Western civilization while trying to poison the very lungs that produce it.
Okay, so they rely entirely on the high-trust, objective frameworks created by the very men they claim to despise.
Exactly.
Okay, but if the modern university, the HR department, and the media are just hosts for this ideological parasite, it begs the question, who infected the host? Where did the parasite come from?
Right, moving from how the institutions act today to who actually engineered this shift.
Yeah. Riker doesn't believe this was a spontaneous cultural accident, right?
Not at all. He points his finger directly at 1920s Germany, specifically the Institute for Sozialforschung, which is much better known as the Frankfurt School.
Okay, setting the scene in 1923.
Yes. He explicitly names Marxist theorists like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse. According to Riker's reading of history, these Marxist intellectuals were facing a massive crisis of faith in the 1920s.
Why? What was happening?
Well, the classic Marxist prophecy, that the working class would violently rise up and overthrow the capitalist bourgeoisie, it was failing miserably in the West.
Right, because capitalism, despite its flaws, was steadily and undeniably improving the standard of living for the working class.
Exactly. The workers didn't want a bloody revolution. They wanted a washing machine and a car.
So instead of admitting that their economic theory was flawed, Riker claims they pivoted.
Yes, they couldn't win the economic war, so they launched a cultural one. They birthed critical theory.
So they basically attempted to destroy Western culture by attacking its foundation.
Precisely. Riker argues that the architects of the Frankfurt School realized that the foundational bedrock of Western capitalism wasn't just the banks. It was traditional male authority and the nuclear family.
So to destroy the system, they had to destroy the bedrock.
Right. They took the classic Marxist economic dynamic of the oppressor versus the oppressed, and they seamlessly superimposed it onto gender and culture.
Wow. So men, specifically competent men, were assigned the permanent role of the oppressor class. And women, and eventually various minority groups, were assigned the permanent role of the oppressed proletariat.
Exactly. And by doing this, they managed to pathologize basic male biology.
Meaning what?
Success, competence, the drive to build, the drive to protect. These were no longer viewed as positive civilizational forces. They were suddenly reframed as systemic oppression.
Which leads into one of the most vivid psychological mechanics Riker outlines in the entire book, the empathy sink.
Yes, the empathy sink.
Let's detail that concept because it's fascinating.
So, Riker argues that in a healthy, functioning civilization based on Judeo-Christian ethics, male empathy is a highly potent, finite resource.
Finite, okay?
Right. It is evolutionarily reserved for the truly deserving, the innocent, the young, the physically defenseless, the truly defeated. But modern society, under the influence of critical theory, has manufactured a bottomless void of entitled narcissism.
He calls it the gynocentric matrix.
Right. And he claims it essentially hacks the male biological instinct to protect. It constantly manufactures crises and elevates victimhood to the highest moral status just to extort compliance.
So when this high-value male empathy is drained by people who simply refuse to take personal responsibility, Riker views it as a parasite feeding on male vitality.
He does. And he brings in modern psychological research to back this up.
Okay, like what?
He points to the work of Scott Lilienfeld. In 2017, Lilienfeld rigorously examined the concept of microaggressions, and he demonstrated that the concept lacked scientific validity and essentially functioned as a tool to hypersensitize people to perceive offense where none was intended.
Right. So Riker uses this to show how the system actively expands the definition of harm, ensuring an endless supply of victims demanding resources.
Exactly. He also points to the firing of James Damore at Google in 2017.
Oh, I remember that. For those who don't remember, Damore was a software engineer who wrote an internal memo. He basically applied basic, widely accepted evolutionary psychology to explain why there might not be a perfect 50-50 gender parity in certain highly technical coding jobs.
Right. He suggested that men and women, on average, have different biological interests.
Yeah.
Men lean toward things and systems, women lean toward people.
And the corporate immune system just attacked him with unprecedented ferocity. Google fired him.
And to Riker, this isn't just a corporate HR dispute. It is absolute proof that the system will actively financially destroy any man who dares to speak objective biological truth if that truth violates the emotional comfort of the collective.
So what does this all mean for the listener? I mean, if you are listening to this on your commute, stuck in traffic, heading to a corporate job, what does Riker say is actually happening to you?
It's a good question.
Is he claiming this was a literal smoke-filled room conspiracy since 1923, where HR departments are secretly reading Herbert Marcuse? Or is he saying it's an emergent behavior of a system that rewards victimhood?
He views it as a synthesis of both, actually. The intellectual virus was engineered in the smoke-filled rooms of the Frankfurt School, but it has now become an emergent automated system.
Okay, how does it automate?
He relies on moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt's work, specifically the Care Harm Foundation. Humans are wired to care for the vulnerable and punish those who harm them.
Right, that makes evolutionary sense.
Well, Riker argues critical theory successfully hijacked this evolutionary foundation. Now, the system operates on autopilot. Modern media, corporate HR departments, and family courts function as automated grievance mills.
So the people running them don't need to be avowed Marxists.
Exactly. They just need to respond to the incentive structures the system has built, which are entirely designed to extract resources, labor, and compliance from competent men and redistribute them based on claims of victimhood.
Wow, okay, so that perfectly bridges the gap between abstract ideology and the tangible economic reality of the listener.
It really does.
Because Riker doesn't just stay in the realm of philosophy. Having established the ideological takeover, he shifts to how this impacts economics.
And he specifically targets one of the most widely cited statistics in modern political discourse.
Yeah.
The gender pay gap.
Right. The idea that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes.
Riker aggressively dismantles this statistic. He refers to it as modern-day alchemy and a gynocentric noble lie.
Modern-day alchemy. Okay, let's break down his economic syllogism here.
So he applies his empirical method to the labor market. He argues that in a free capitalist market, compensation is not doled out based on identity. It is dictated by brutally objective factors.
Like risk, hours, and marginal productivity.
Yes, and he points directly to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. When you look at the most dangerous, fatal jobs in the country, structural iron and steel workers, roofers, loggers, oil rig operators, underwater welders, they are overwhelmingly, sometimes 98% male.
Right, because men biologically and systematically choose higher risk, higher stress, and higher hour occupations.
Therefore, his conclusion is purely mathematical. The gender pay gap is not evidence of a sprawling, invisible, patriarchal conspiracy to underpay women for the exact same work.
So what is it then?
He argues that when you control for hours worked, commute times, danger, and occupational choices, the gap practically vanishes. What remains is the mathematical signature of male sacrifice. The pay gap is the footprint of a strict meritocracy, where men are actively trading their physical safety, their health, and their time for resources to provide for their families.
Got it. And he contrasts this historical reality of male provision with modern legal and governmental frameworks, right?
He does. He points back to the Roman paterfamilias, where the male head of the household held supreme legal authority and responsibility for his family's welfare.
And he links this to John Locke's social contract, which was predicated on the state protecting the private property of the men who actually labored to acquire it.
Exactly. But Riker claims the modern welfare state has entirely breached this foundational contract.
Because it acts as a surrogate husband.
That's his phrasing, yes.
Yeah.
He argues it taxes the labor of competent men, the men building the infrastructure and taking the risks, and redistributes that wealth to subsidize female irresponsibility and single motherhood.
So, in his view, this explicitly punishes male competence to fund societal entropy.
Yes. And to illustrate the sheer civilizational cost of abandoning meritocracy, Riker makes a fascinating geographical comparison between the Appian Way and modern-day Detroit.
Right, the Appian Way was built in 312 BC, correct.
Yes, and it was an absolute engineering marvel, constructed on immutable laws of physics, brutal labor, and strict meritocratic execution. It has literally stood for millennia.
And he contrasts this triumph of patriarchal engineering with Detroit.
Right. Detroit was once hailed as the arsenal of democracy, the absolute peak of American industrial might and middle-class provision.
But Riker argues that Detroit fell into decay the precise moment it abandoned its patriarchal pragmatism.
Exactly. When the city's leadership shifted from prioritizing industrial competence to focusing on the emotional sentimentality of the welfare state and identity politics, the infrastructure literally crumbled.
And he brings the second law of thermodynamics into this economic critique, which is a powerful mechanistic analogy.
It really is. The second law states that within a closed system, entropy or disorder constantly increases.
Without the aggressive, continuous expenditure of energy, everything decays. A bridge rusts, a road cracks, a society collapses.
And Riker maps this thermodynamic reality onto modern comfort. He looks at hyper-accessible pornography, endless video games, processed junk food, and guaranteed welfare checks.
He essentially says society is domesticating men by keeping them too comfortable to fight back.
Yes, keeping them just sedated enough with digital dopamine that they lose the aggressive energy required to fight against the creeping entropy of the state.
But wait, I have to push back on the foundational logic of that analogy.
Sure, go ahead.
Riker compares modern comfort to entropy. But isn't the entire goal of human civilization to create comfort? We build houses to escape the discomfort of the rain. We invent agriculture to escape the discomfort of starvation.
Right.
So if a civilization successfully produces a surplus of comfort enough video games and food for everyone, hasn't it fundamentally succeeded at its primary objective?
Well, that question cuts to the absolute core of the philosophical divide here.
Yeah.
Because to Riker, comfort is the leash.
The leash?
Yes. He vehemently rejects the idea the purpose of civilization is to become a sterilized, pain-free daycare center. He argues the purpose of civilization is the flourishing of excellence, what the ancient Greeks called arete.
Okay, so artificially propping up the incompetent over the competent violates reality for him.
Exactly. If it removes the natural penalties for failure, it's destructive. To thrive, to maintain a grasp on objective truth, Riker argues that a man must actively, intentionally court discomfort.
And he points to Vice Admiral James Stockdale as the ultimate modern archetype of this anti-fragility, right?
Yes, Stockdale's story is incredible. He was shot down over North Vietnam in 1965 and became the highest-ranking naval officer held in the infamous Hanoi Hilton.
Right.
He endured 7.5 years of unimaginable physical and psychological torture without breaking. And he didn't survive through baseless optimism.
No, he relied heavily on the stoic philosophy of Epictetus. He accepted the brutal reality of his situation while maintaining absolute sovereignty over his own mind.
Right. Riker uses Stockdale to illustrate the architecture of true psychological independence. If a man voluntarily subjects himself to physical and mental adversity, he becomes completely immune to the cheap manipulations of modern political fear-mongering.
You cannot threaten a man with social ostracization if he has already mastered isolation.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have spent the bulk of our time mapping Riker's diagnosis of the disease.
The capture of the universities, the thermodynamic collapse of the economy, the weaponization of empathy.
Right. So what is his prescription? If a listener actually accepts this framework, how does Riker tell them to survive and conquer this landscape?
This brings us to his final thesis: reclaiming the forge and retreating to the fortress of solitude.
So what's the immediate catalyst for this call to action?
The relentless, systemic cultural emasculation he perceives all around us. He uses the infamous 2019 Procter & Gamble "The Best Men Can Be" advertisement as a prime example.
Right, the Gillette ad.
Yeah.
That ad essentially lectured men about toxic masculinity, bullying, and mansplaining.
And Riker views this not as a clumsy marketing campaign, but as a deliberate corporate attempt to pathologize the very concept of traditional masculinity.
He also looks at decades of pop culture archetypes, right?
Yes. Think about the standard sitcom family dynamic over the last 30 years. From The Simpsons to Modern Family to just countless commercials.
You almost universally have the hyper-competent, highly intelligent, exasperated matriarch.
And she constantly has to clean up the messes of the bumbling, emotionally stunted, completely incompetent father figure. Homer Simpson's The Blueprint.
Right. Riker calls this a massive psychological operation designed to condition generations of boys to view their own masculine authority as inherently foolish and unnecessary.
And he measures the devastating psychological toll of this cultural conditioning with a very sobering statistic. He cites a 2021 study by the Survey Center on American Life.
Okay, what did it find?
It revealed a massive friendship recession among men. Nearly 15% of modern American men report having exactly 0 close friends.
Wait, 15% of men have 0 close friends.
0. Yeah, it's wild. That number has skyrocketed over the past few decades. Men are wandering the landscape completely atomized, isolated, and disconnected from natural fraternal support systems.
And Riker views this atomization not as an accidental byproduct of technology, but as the desired outcome of a system that wants to replace male brotherhood with complete reliance on the state.
Because isolated men are dependent men.
Wow. So his solution is incredibly radical. He advocates for absolute rejection of the current system.
Total rejection. He calls the first step reclaiming the forge. And he means this quite literally in a physical, biological sense.
Right, applying Newtonian physics directly to the endocrine system.
Yes, he is prescribing progressive overload in the gym, heavy deadlifts, cold showers, strict intermittent fasting.
He views this physical cultivation as almost a divine mandate. He actually cites the Apostle Paul's letter to the Corinthians that the body is a temple.
But his reasoning goes far beyond aesthetics or health. To Riker, you cannot fight an ideological war with an estrogen-dominant, sedated biology. Physical strength is the anchor of rationality.
If you cannot impose your will on physical resistance, like if you can't pick a heavy weight off the floor, he argues you have no valid epistemology, your mind will remain soft and susceptible to emotional manipulation.
Exactly. If your body has never been forged by physical struggle, you're vulnerable.
But, I mean, lifting weights in your garage isn't going to overthrow a cultural hegemony. It's not just about biology, it's about social reorganization.
Right, which is why he demands that men retreat to what he calls a fortress of solitude.
Okay, explain the fortress of solitude.
Because the mainstream institutions are completely captured, he wants men to build decentralized, male-only networks, spaces to pool capital, share philosophy, and develop survival strategies far outside the surveillance and influence of the HR-dominated state.
And he draws immense historical inspiration from the Enlightenment's Republic of Letters, right?
He does. This was a phenomenon where men like Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson corresponded across oceans to build alternative intellectual networks outside the control of the monarchy and the church.
He also points to the Edwardian Gentlemen's Clubs of London.
Yes, modern sociologists often frame these clubs as sinister centers of patriarchal oppression, but Riker frames them as monumental engines of high-trust collaboration.
They were physical spaces where competent men negotiated treaties, funded global scientific expeditions, and spoke objective truth without the presence of emotional policing.
Exactly. And he points out a glaring cultural hypocrisy regarding these spaces.
What hypocrisy?
He highlights how the mainstream media wildly celebrated the wing. Do you remember the wing?
Oh, yeah, it was a very popular female-focused co-working space founded in 2016.
Right, and it flatly prohibited men from joining or even entering. The media praised it as an empowering, necessary sanctuary.
But Riker notes, if men try to build the exact same civic organization, a private space dedicated solely to male brotherhood and intellectual development, it is immediately sued, protested, and smeared by that same media as a dangerous bastion of toxic patriarchy.
To Riker, this proves the establishment views female spaces as sacred and male spaces as an existential threat to its control.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker invokes Voltaire's Candide, specifically the idea of cultivating your garden. But if the most competent, rational men completely withdraw their labor and build underground monasteries, isn't he just guaranteeing the collapse of the very civilization he wants to save?
I mean, if the men holding the bridge up walk away, the bridge falls, right? Well, Riker's answer to that is rooted in pure cold Roman pragmatism. He views the current mainstream institutions as a rotting corpse. They're already dead, they just haven't fallen over yet.
So his strategy isn't to save the Matrix at all.
Not in the slightest. He points out that when the Visigoths finally sacked Rome, they weren't destroying a robust republic. They were sacking a civilization that had already sacrificed its vigor to the comforts of bread and circuses centuries earlier.
So you don't negotiate with a parasite.
And you certainly don't try to heal the host when the infection is terminal. You starve it, His strategy is for the red-pilled man to become the neo-patriarch.
Meaning you withdraw your competence, you withdraw your financial support, and you let the corrupted systems collapse under the immense dead weight of their own mandated incompetence.
Yes, your only duty is to ensure that you have built impervious, stoic networks. Your fortress of solitude capable of outlasting the impending Dark Ages. You don't try to save the ruins of Rome, you survive the sack, and you rebuild from the rubble using the immutable laws of logic and physics.
Wow. Okay, let's take a collective breath here. We have just taken a massive, sweeping, incredibly deep journey through Conrad Riker's worldview in his ebook, Barbarians at the Gates of Reason.
We really have.
We've traced his intellectual architecture from the rigorous logic of Aristotle's Organon to the ideological machinations of the Frankfurt School, all the way down to the practical application of Newtonian physics and progressive overload in the squat rack.
It is an intense, unyielding, and totally unapologetic framework.
Absolutely. So, as a reminder to everyone listening, if you want to dive into the source material for yourself and explore the granular details of these arguments firsthand, go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the book.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to explore more of his ongoing writings, cultural analysis, and philosophical essays.
We also want to remind you to please like and subscribe to this show so you never miss our future deep dives into the text shaping our cultural conversations. We deeply appreciate you taking this complex journey with us today.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day, perhaps as you sit in traffic or head to the gym.
Let's hear it.
Riker argues with absolute conviction that to save the virtues of Western civilization, the reason, the infrastructure, the rigorous logic men must completely isolate themselves from the empathy and emotional integration of modern society. He demands a tactical retreat into a stoic fortress of solitude.
Right.
But this raises a profound, inescapable question. If a thriving human civilization fundamentally requires both the cold, unyielding logic to build its bridges and the warm, binding empathy to hold its citizens together in a shared social contract,
Yeah.
does intentionally amputating one half of the human experience in order to save the other actually result in a civilization worth living in?
Wow. Something to think about. We'll see you on the next deep dive.